There we go. Hello. Greetings from Tokyo. This is Daisuke. And I hope you are all well. Just getting ready here for the live stream talking about Night of the Living Dead. So just give me one moment here while I set up. And let's see. I hope you are well. I hope the sound is okay. If so, we can get going in about a couple minutes. So let's see. I don't know what the time. It's now about 5:58 in AM here. So just getting ready for. Okay, I have to put this up here as well. I'll put this up there, and we can start getting going in a couple minutes. Okay, let's see. Oh, yes. Hold on for 1 second. Oh, there it is. Just have to get my water. Okay. Okay, sorry about this. Just getting ready here. I woke up about just a little bit later than usual, so I'm still, to be perfectly honest, I'm still a little bit. It's the morning, so I think I'm trying to be a morning person, or I am a morning person. At least I thought it was, but I'm finding that maybe slowly as I get a little bit older, the morning hours tend to be a little bit more difficult. But anyway, I think there's a lot to talk about actually. So why don't I just begin, and we can go from there. So once again, I just want to make sure is the sound okay? If the sound is a little bit patchy or something, just let me know, and I'll try to fix it. But I think we are good. Great. Thank you very much. So, Jared, thank you very much for letting me know. Paula, thank you very much for letting me know. And good morning, and well, good morning where I am. Maybe good evening or good afternoon wherever you are in the world. But in any event, my friends, greetings from Tokyo. As always, this is Daisuke, and I hope all of you are having a very nice day today. Today it is my pleasure, my absolute pleasure, to be able to share with you a few thoughts that I might have on this landmark achievement, this work from 1968 from the United States. It's a low budget American independent horror film, but I think it is so much more. This is, of course, the film Night of the Living Dead, or so Night of the Living Dead. This, of course, is that there are, of course, a lot of horror films in the world, and there are a lot of horror films that can be considered groundbreaking in terms of moving the ball forward, as it were, or pushing the envelope in terms of the development of the genre. But I think this film is certainly among that group of films. It's quite distinguished in that way, I think. But in many ways, it really pushed the genre, I think, in ways and directions that I don't think even the filmmakers could have anticipated. And I think George Romero alludes to such during some of his subsequent talk of the film and discussion of the film after the fact. But and I mean that because this film, I think, is just so it's so explosive in all directions in terms of its presentation, its violence, its themes, and its real social commentaries and the like. And so I think it just, when I said there were films that were groundbreaking, well, I think this could be one of the most groundbreaking films in the genre. I mean, I could even dare say that in many ways, I think it's the most groundbreaking in the horror genre. And that's not to take away from any other horror film, don't get me wrong, but I think this film just, I think, pushed the boundaries so much. And for that reason alone, I think it's a film that continues to be talked about even to this very day, for many reasons, of course, but it is incredibly powerful, and even now, it never fails to sort of provoke in me a reaction that is very, I think, the reactions I have are many, because they go in many different directions, and it's quite complicated, actually. So, and I hope to try to be able to explain what it is I'm trying to express here with a bit more clarity as we go forward. But I just want to say, that as an opening, that this is one of the most brilliant and, in many ways, complicated works that I have ever come across in the horror genre. And so it'll be my pleasure to be able to speak about this with you today. And for me, more importantly, to hear your thoughts about this film. As you know, the live chat is open, so you can leave your thoughts in the live chat window, and you can talk with me or you can talk with others there, and I think that will be a very fun, hopefully that will be a very fun time. It certainly will be a fun time for me to be able to listen to what it is you have to say. So I also would like to say just at the outset that I will be talking about this film in detail, including the ending. So, of course, I think you just have to be careful if you haven't seen the film, that you're going to be spoiled if you haven't seen the film and you're watching this live stream. And so I would just very gently suggest that this live stream will be a video on YouTube, and it'll be uploaded as soon as the live stream is over. So you can always come back after the fact. So I would suggest that you maybe turn off the live stream or video and then watch the film, and then you can come back at any time and you can watch the video or leave a comment, and or maybe see what the other people have to say about the film in the live chat discussion, which will also be up after the live stream is over. Also, I should say that in the live stream, live chat, I will try to focus on all of your comments and questions to the best of my ability. But please understand that I don't want to focus too much on matters and films other than Night of the Living Dead. So if you want to ask me a question that is not related to this film, I might just skip over it, and that's just please forgive me ahead of time for that if that does come up. So I don't want to ignore your question, but just please understand that I do want to focus more or less on Night of the Living Dead, and that also goes for the other Romero zombie films. As some of you may know, that there are other zombie films that he has made after Night of the Living Dead. And so I think it might be tempting, on the one hand, to talk about those other films and collectively in this, which is what I thought about doing. But I will also be I don't want to focus too much on Dawn of the Dead or Day of the Dead or the others. I want to focus on Night of the Living Dead. So I don't want to I'm not going to be talking too much about, or not too well. Actually, there's one point that I do want to make about Night of the Living Dead in relation to the later Dead films, but that's going to be a very small part of the conversation from my point of view, from my end, because I don't plan on talking almost at all about the other Romero Dead films, and so I will let's save that for another day. Although there is a lot, a ton to talk about when it comes to that. So just keep that in mind also. And finally, I should say, and I tried to allude to this in another video that I made, but there are so many releases of Night of the Living Dead out there. There's the Criterion version. There are other DVD releases. There are a lot of DVD releases, in fact, and VHS and Laserdisc, and there have been different versions released in terms of a colorized version. There was another version that was released many, many years after the fact, where new footage was actually shot and then it was inserted primarily at the beginning and the end, and a little bit elsewhere, but primarily at the beginning and the end to an attempt to try to round out the story, but they added new characters. There were new actors brought in. There were also actors from the film itself. I think in particular William Heinzman, who plays the cemetery zombie, I think was brought in for specific scenes that were then shot and then added on. You know, it's quite famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, I suppose. But I won't be talking about that version at all. I don't. I'm a little bit mixed about that particular version, to be perfectly honest. But I I do want to focus my attention and energies here today with you on this film, Night of the Living Dead, this version. What is it? It's 90 minutes plus. Is it 96 minutes according to the back of the Criterion Blu-ray here? And so I want to focus on this version. And with that, my friends, let's begin. So before we get into this, let me just say a quick greetings and good morning from Tokyo, just to our friends who are visiting. So let's see. So Jared, hello, I hope you're well. Mike in Las Vegas, and Abram also in Las Vegas. That's interesting. Hello. JR62, hello, how are you doing? Jared says, casting Dwayne Jones in the role of Ben was very talked about back in 1968, along with the violent content of the film. This is such a fantastic film. Yes, thank you. And I will try to address my thoughts about the point that you bring up about the character of Ben and the fact that Dwayne Jones is in this role, and the character of Ben himself. I think Ben is really one of the most it is one of the most fascinating and complicated elements of the film in many ways, and so you bring it up quite nicely here, Jared. So I do want to talk about that. JR62, yes, great Halloween season classic. I agree. Nazarene Prod, hello. Paula, hello. Carl's Ransom Reviews, hello. And Mike says, watched Night of the Living Dead last night. The Criterion version looks absolutely stunning. And Jay, hello. And let's see. Rob is here, hello. And Melinda, hello, my friend. How are you doing? It's nice to see you. And Isaac, hello. In a Hitchcockian accent. So that's great. Good evening. So that's really great. Heirloom Providence, hello. And let's see. Ole Christensen, hello. Good evening, hello. Yes, Jared says, truly an inspirational film in more ways than one. Let's see. And Paula says, I love this one so much that I went out and bought the Criterion Blu-ray. It was only $14 on Amazon US for a time. Crazy good deal. That is really good. That's a great deal. I mean, you're getting 2 discs packed. Great presentation of the film. You're getting the work print version of the film, which I understand was, I don't my understanding was it was never made available, at least as far as I understand. Maybe some people could find it on, I don't know, a bootleg copy or something, but I never, I understood it was never available. I'm talking about Night of Anubis, which is the work print version. It's not a different version of the film, of course, but it's a kind of an early draft of the film. And let's see. Okay, so let's. I'm gonna just stop there because that Paula's comment, and I'll return to the live chat. But let's just begin with the film itself. And there's a lot to talk about, but let's start with the film itself and its construction and plot, and specifically what aspects of the film that I find really fascinating and memorable. So there's a lot to be said about the fact that the film is low budget. There's a lot to be said about the fact that the film is this black and white affair. It's there are some points where it looks like it's shot. There's some handheld moments. There's some moments where everything seems to be set on a tripod or something like that. It's stationary with certain camera movements that tend to be very fluid. That there are other moments that it tends to be almost cinema verite in its approach. And indeed, I think some aspects of the film, like the newsroom that's shown on the TV during the news reports, and the reporting from Washington when reporters are trying to get at certain government officials as to the cause of the thing, and if they would trying to acknowledge or get official acknowledgement from the government as to whether or not indeed it was the Venus probe radiation that is the cause of this or not, etc. So there is this cinema's verite type of approach to this, and I think, but it is a low budget affair, and I think on the one hand, some of that low budget stuff might be seen as a weakness. And I say that as a sort of hypothetical beginning, because there are moments where it does look a bit shaky at first glance, and you can see shadows of the microphones or something, or you can see little things at the corner which seem to suggest kind of odd, maybe blocking of the lens, or you can see there's one moment when Ben and Tom are they've agreed to go out and try to get into the truck and go to the gas pump and fill up the truck with gas, right? And they've agreed to the plan with Cooper, of course, staying inside. A very interesting detail, by the way. But and Cooper is a character that I will try to talk about later. He's, again, he and Ben are one of the most fascinating set of characters I've ever come across in a horror film. But my point is that when Tom and Ben are taking off the boards on the front door there, about to get outside and go into the truck, you can actually see a moment where Ben is taking off a board and, that's nailed to across one of the corners, the top corner of the door there. I think the upper right corner. You can take it down. You actually can see writing on the back of the board. Now that writing was apparently written there by the crew in order to enable them to know what boards went where on what doors and stuff, so they could make sure they could plan accordingly, so that they could maintain the continuity if they had to take off the boards between takes of the film, etc. So. And then there are other moments where it seems like the film, in terms of its special effects, is a little bit, maybe it doesn't necessarily go to the explicit VFX grandiose heights that, say, films that in like Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead Tom Savini and his crew, that they would perform, right? So it's in many respects it's very low budget. It might be seen to be somewhat of a weakness in terms of its low budgetness, but I actually if would disagree with that viewpoint in terms of the low budgetness of the film in many respects being a weakness. On the contrary, I think the film's low budget feel is one of its strengths. It's one of its great strengths, actually. Uh, there's a great supplement here on the Criterion Blu-ray. It's by Taylor Ramos and Tony Zhou, the crew behind the fabulous Every Frame painting, and they created a short video essay called, I think, Limitations into Virtues, and they speak to this point much more articulately than I can, but I think one of their many points is the fact that the film is using this low budgetness almost as a means to promote its style, and almost as a means, therefore, to heighten atmosphere, to heighten tension, and to create a sense of dread almost. It's almost like it's used on purpose. This low budget aspect, it's used on purpose in order to really drive the point home in terms of what the film is trying to do. What's an example? So, for example, let's go back to the sort of the low budget, the seemingly amateurish look, let's put it that way, of the handheld camera in certain places. It's especially in the farmhouse and all that. I think, in terms of how the camera it cuts from one character and it cuts to another character, and it seems like the camera tends to cross the axis, so to speak. The characters aren't on the same plane, as it were. One character is talking in one direction, and it cuts to the other character to whom he's talking, and it's in the same direction, and so it doesn't seem to fit in terms of traditional filmmaking. I'm talking, for example, Ben is first talking with Cooper after Cooper and Tom have just come out of the basement there, and there's a little bit of a heated discussion between Ben and Cooper, and there isn't necessarily that sense of cross-cutting between two characters matching. But I think actually that really elevates the film at that point, because it creates, at least in my mind, almost a sense of, how should I put it, kind of unease, because it throws me off. Now it's very obvious. It's like, one character talks and then it cuts to the other character talks, and then it goes back to the other character, and the other character talks, and all that, and it doesn't go from here to here to here. It goes from here and then goes here, and then it goes like that in a very crude way of my trying to describe it. But my point is that it feels almost unnatural to what I tend to be used to, what I've been programmed to be used to in my mind when it comes to traditional, let's say, Hollywood filmmaking technique of cross-cutting between two characters as they're having a discussion. But in fact, because of the fact that it doesn't go along with what I'm used to. In fact, it goes against what I'm used to. That creates a sense of unease. And I think that unease at that particular moment is wonderful, because it is almost like a visual metaphor, if you will, for the fact that these two characters, Ben and Cooper, will be at odds, and they will be at odds for the rest of the film until the very climax, when that relationship resolves itself in a very shocking way. And so I think that little, let's say, low budget aspect still is to the film's favor. Now, I'm not saying that the filmmakers intentionally did this or not, and I think George Romero and crew will be the first to admit that, and I think they've admitted in commentaries and say, oh, that was a mistake or something like that. But so I'm not trying to suggest that these things will be are meant to be purposeful cinematic tricks on the part of the filmmakers. But what I am suggesting is that mistakes or not mistakes, whether they were purposeful or not, regardless, the end result is, I think, in my mind, quite. It's without doubt, it has an effect. It has a really great effect. Another aspect of this low budgetness that I want to bring to your attention is also the idea of the acting and the fact that it seems quite clear that I think for the most part, or not maybe for the most part, but some of the more memorable roles are being played by people who aren't actors, and or they are unknown actors, and they're coming to this really for the first time. And I think a lot of that also is very effective. For instance, I always forget his name. George Kasana, who plays the Sheriff McClellan, right? And he's the person who's shown on the news report at first with Bill Cardille, and he's shown with the group of men trying to just move around the Pennsylvania countryside, essentially, and just shooting down all the zombies that they can find. And he, of course, has that famous line, they're dead, they're all messed up. Right? Well, he wasn't an actor, apparently, and so there is the fact that he's not an actor gives that role and gives that whole thing a real sense of realism. But it comes from the fact that he wasn't an actor, and the fact that they didn't hire a real actor to play that role. But it feels very kind of raw and almost in your face on the one hand, but it's very it makes that particular element very realistic and believable, and that just adds to the horror of this thing, which is this feels like it could happen. I mean, it's a very fantastic story, fantastic as in fantasy-like story, of course, but still, those things ground the film with a real sense of realism. That realism, of course, is augmented further in the camera approach, the verite approach, even in the farmhouse when you have these, we have the people boarded up there in the farmhouse. Not all the time. I mean, granted, sometimes the film goes into moments where it has a real almost warped visual style. Sometimes the lighting is so it's so drastic. What's the fancy art term from chiaroscuro, I think, but in terms of the use of light and shadow and darkness, it's almost like it's coming out of a scene from the cabinet of Dr. Caligari or something. But there are other times when, as soon as the lights go up and things start to settle down in the middle of the film, the film almost is like it's shooting these characters in almost a documentary type of way. In particular, for example, when they are setting up the TV and they're saying fiddle with the Cooper says in his very Cooper-like way, he doesn't actively help with the setting, he just tells people what to do, fiddle with the rabbit ears and stuff. So, but my point is that and I love, before I forget, I love how Ben says, he's so fed up and just says, shut up to Cooper, and then he sits down and they're watching the TV. Notice how Ben sits down in a chair just in front of the TV and everyone else is watching the TV as well. He's got the gun at that point, and he has which I would assume is still loaded. He doesn't think about safety. He has the gun, he puts it on his lap, and if you notice, it's actually pointed in the direction of Cooper. You've got this loaded gun, and he's watching TV, and he's got it resting on his legs, and he's leaning on it, and I think it's pointed. I don't think it's on purpose, but it's pointed in the direction where Cooper's standing. I think that's actually kind of that's a real dangerous thing to do, actually. If you have a loaded gun, you don't want to point it at someone, even if you don't have any if you don't have any intention of firing it at that time. So I think that's actually quite dangerous. But and that's actually another aspect of Ben's character that I will try to get to later. But my point with that, sorry for getting ahead of myself here, but my point of that particular moment in the film is that that feels like a documentary type of shot. They're just, the camera's just there capturing the moment, as it were, as it's happening in real time. But of course it's not a documentary. Of course that was a planned shot in a narrative film. But my point is that it does feel like that, and other moments do feel like a documentary type of film, which like the whole thing with the news reports and everything, does add this sense of, oh, this could be real. It's almost like War of the Worlds, you know, this could be happening, right? And before I get to the chat, there's one thing I do want to say about this low budget feel of this, and how it could be seen as a weakness. You know, as I was growing up, one of the things I always thought, you know, when I was younger, one of the things I thought was one of the real weaknesses of the film. Genuinely, I thought that one of the real weaknesses was in the film was the Tom and Judy storyline. I thought that storyline was quite. I thought that was quite weak. I thought that was the weakest part, because especially Tom, you know, Tom and the Keith Wayne, who is a singer, who's a singer and performer, apparently. I always thought when I was growing up that his performance wasn't, how should I put it? I always thought it wasn't necessarily the strongest performance, and the scene that always got to me in terms of, oh yeah, that's really it's kind of iffy, is the moment where they just figured out, the group has just seen the TV about the going to the rescue stations, and they see one of the rescue stations listed as one for Willard, and Ben says, oh, Willard, and he's talking and asking about Willard, and he asks Tom about Willard, and do you know this area? And then Tom just rather randomly goes into his little story, if you will, and he's just standing there and he just does the thing that Tom does, which is he just says a line and then halts, and then says a line and then halts, and then says a line and halts again. He just gives his backstory rather randomly. And remember, Ben was just asking about Willard and does he know this area, and then Tom kind of goes into his story about what happened, how he got into the house, how he met the Coopers, and all. It seems to be a little bit it seems to be a little bit off, and by extension, that storyline between Tom and Judy, right, when they're about to go out, Tom and Ben are about to go out into the darkness and try to get gas into the truck, rather disastrously, of course. But before that, there's that moment between Tom and Judy alone, and you know, I'm paraphrasing what Tom says. Tom says to Judy, you know, how can you smile at me? How can you have a smile like that for me all the time, or something like that? And he says that sort of thing, and they have a sort of a kiss, and of course it's panicking, and we get a sense of Judy's character, and she seems to be a little bit, I don't want to say childish, but she seems very hesitant to want to move, and she doesn't want to leave Tom, and I think that adds to her character, and we get a glimpse as to why in fact she does what she does at a very key moment in the film. But for the longest time, I always thought that moment was a little bit weak. It went in a direction that I felt seemed to be very random. You know, this not really romance necessarily, but they do kiss, and they do have this genuine sense of emotion that's expressed between the two of them at that particular moment. I always thought that was weak, but these two aspects, I think, are a great example of what I'm trying to suggest here. The low budgetness of the film actually going towards the film's favor and really helping the film. What do I mean? So going back to the Tom exchange for a minute, and Tom's the character of Tom, it's very stiff character in terms of how it's expressing itself, but I like that actually, because it's really befitting, because Tom is a character that is really in the middle of the struggle between Ben and Cooper. It's a real psychological war between these two poles, and Tom is kind of stuck in the middle. He then sides with Ben, of course, which gives Ben all the more reason to one up Cooper, at least in the first half. But when Tom is out of the equation, then you really sense the film in terms of Ben having been weakened in terms of his ongoing battle with Cooper. There's a real sense of emptiness that is left behind after Tom and Judy have died. So Tom as a character, I think, is very important, and the fact that he's quote unquote neutral, I think, it makes his sort of hesitant, halting manner, I think, quite appropriate, because it's almost like it's a visual representation of him trying to figure out in his mind which side is he to go on. Is he go here or here? So it's almost like he's struggling in his mind, just like he's sort of struggling with the words, if you know what I mean. That's a real terrible way of putting it. That sounds rather rude. I don't mean it in a bad way. I mean it in the fact that it does feel like he is really trying to struggle. At the same time, he's trying to be clear with his words. He's trying to it's not like he's going with all the nuance. Everything is like this, like this, like this, in terms of his thinking, and also in manner of speaking. So I think that's a really nice combination of sort of physical characteristic traits, if you will, on the one hand, and then his inner psychology on the other hand. So I think that's a perfect match. And so his approach and his manner of speaking dialogue, I think is actually quite genius. And it really adds to the sense of where he is as a character in the film. Also, I love that exchange between Ben and Tom, what I alluded to earlier. Ben says, "Oh, Willard, do you know this area?" And then Tom seems to go off on a slight tangent. It doesn't quite match that conversation, if you know what I mean. And as I said, I first thought that was a weakness, right? But actually, no, that's a real strength, the more I think about it, because that's another example, actually. If you think of the film as being a collection of characters that have the inability to be able to communicate with each other, amongst each other, in an effective way, right? Ben and Barbara don't seem to be connecting quite clearly. There seems to be a real lack of communication at the gas pump scene. But that lack of communication, and there's definitely a lack of communication between Ben and Cooper, which leads in many ways to the downfall of the group. But I think a great example of that is even in these little moments, that conversation between Ben and Tom about Willard, and Tom just goes off on a little thing. It's almost like they're not even connecting on this very simple aspect, and I really love that. I love that how even a little moment like this can just speak towards a real fundamentally important theme of the film. And so that moment with Tom, what I thought up to now might have been a weakness, actually is one of the strengths of the film. And that's really one of the, in many ways, one of the key moments of the film for me, of many key moments, of course. And then finally, the sort of the not romance, but the young lovers, if you will, the two young people in the, maybe it might have been seen as being a kind of corny scene between the two of them. But in fact, I would suggest that sort of tone between the two of them, it's really nice on the one hand, because their closeness really contrasts rather magnificently with the coldness that exists between Helen Cooper and Harry Cooper. Right? The two of them are not at all right. It's Helen says, we may, she actually says, we may not enjoy living with each other, right? And so that's suggestive of the fact that they have a very frosty relationship. But the Tom and Judy relationship, I think, really adds a nice contrast to that. But going back to how it might be seen as corny, okay, it might be seen as corny, but what, 5 minutes after that, they're out in the truck. They're trying to get gas into the truck, and it goes just disastrously wrong, disastrously, to the point where Tom and Judy are just, they're in the truck, and it catches on fire and it explodes, and they die. They just die suddenly. So, you know, it's almost like that sort of horror cliche that you see a lot in horror films, you know, where, you know, the character is like, you know, I'll see you as soon as I get back, or something like that. And of course, that's just that's setting up the fact that such character is going to die. You know, it could be that kind of horror cliche, but I would suggest that it's something more. I would suggest that here we do have this. It's not over the top corny, in terms of their expressing their emotional connection, because they are talking about it still in the context of a panic and an emergency. And right, and Tom brings up the story about, remember, you know, you felt this way at the time when there was a big flood, and you know, it was the right thing to do then to go to Willard, and she says, I know. So they are talking about this in the context of an emergency, and Judy said, you know, I just don't want it to be you to go, that's all. And so that brings them together. And also, as I said, it helps to show Judy's character, because it helps to explain why Judy decides to go out with them rather than stay in the farmhouses, because she really wants to be with Tom, and she's worried about Tom. And I think that's a very relatable thing to do, to have. So that scene is not unimportant. The scene between Tom and Judy, it's not unimportant, but it is tonally somewhat different. But the fact that it's tonally different from what their outcome is, namely they're going to be dead in about 5 minutes from then, I think creates this huge shock. It creates this huge shock when Tom and Judy indeed die in the explosion. And then not only that, they are subject to the moments of zombie eating, which I think is the first time that we actually see zombies on screen eating the human flesh. And so, which is a real just shocking moment. So you go from this tender moment between two characters, and they even kiss, and the lovely melodramatic music on the one hand, and then 5 minutes later, they're gone. They're obliterated. Grand Guignol, emphatic, not double exclamation point, you know, quadruple exclamation point style. They are just obliterated and then some. They are obliterated, and then to top that, they are eaten. So I find, therefore, that tonal shift is so sudden, so dramatic, and therefore that sense of low budgetness in that particular moment adds to the shock when we realize the outcome of these characters 5 minutes after the fact. So I think, therefore, that weakness turns into a strength immediately. And so what I thought about those aspects of the film growing up as a kid, I now find to be the film's strengths, or among the film's many strengths. And so I do want to say one other thing about this before I go into the comments here, which is, you know, I suggested that it is a low-budget film, and perhaps that might be suggestive at first of the fact that it might be seen to be a kind of you know, rough shot, kind of roughly put together sort of affair. But I would just emphasize the fact that I still think that the film is really tightly constructed. It is so tightly constructed that this was something that is not just randomly put together, improvised thing that was just put together. This was so meticulously planned, and it's further evidenced by the fact that it's so tightly edited, and everything is set up so well. You know, I don't think there is any. I mean, there are little bits that just tend to be jarring and stuff, but everything is really planned so nicely. Like, I love the little detail. Remember when Barbara is in the farmhouse first alone, and the first thing, you know, she gets a knife, right? And then she goes like that. And then later, when she and Ben are together, she puts the knife on the top of the refrigerator, along with the stack of short pieces of wood there. And then it's sort of forgotten about until we then get to the point later in the film where one of the zombies comes through one of the boarded windows, and it's up to Ben and Tom to try to force it away. And what does Tom do? If you recall, he goes to the top of the refrigerator and fiddles around with a piece of wood, and he gets the knife from there. It's amazing that he had the wherewithal to think, oh, I should get the knife. Oh, there it is on top. He didn't remember. I don't think he knew about the knife to begin with, so he just grabbed it. So actually, he's a pretty reliable character, Tom. But my point is that I love that setup of the knife. The film had it took the care and time to set up the fact that the knife was there, and then he then used it in order to really gruesomely cut off the fingers of the zombie's hand there, which is one of the most. That's one of the grossest part of the film for me. It just comes out of nowhere, and that too, that's shot in a very cinema verite sort of way, and it's very subtle. There's no blood splurt or anything like that, but it's very subtle. And that's also kind of a low budget approach to the film that adds to a sense of horror realism, if you know what I mean. But I love that setup with the knife on the top of the refrigerator there. It's really nice. I think one thing, I'm sorry to keep going on, but one other thing I should say about this low budgetness is there is one particular moment that I think is rather infamous, that might be seen as being a real one step too far as in terms of the editing of this, which is the scene in the basement. It's a rather infamous scene in the basement between Helen and Harry, when Harry reveals to his wife, to Helen, that there's a radio upstairs, and she gets all upset. There's a radio up there, and you boarded us up down here, and so that causes Helen to want to go up to the farmhouse and what's going on. And there's that famous jump cut where you have Helen and Harry in frame, and Helen is talking to Tom upstairs, and it jump cuts suddenly to the two of them standing there again, and they're just in a slightly different position, and so that is seen, I think, by George Romero and Carl Hardman and Marilyn Eastman and crew during, for instance, their commentary. That's seen as being a big glaring mistake. And in fact, what happened was apparently there was supposed to be an extra shot that was to be included in between those two shots of the Coopers. There's the shot of the Coopers, and then suddenly it cuts to another shot of the Coopers in almost the same position. Well, in between those two shots, there was apparently supposed to be another insert of, I think, the zombies, but that was taken out, and so it was just left. You're just left with those two shots of the Coopers, and they seem to be close enough that they could have gotten away with it. But in fact, it's not close enough. It just feels like a sudden jump cut, and so that might seem to many to feel like a mistake, another low budget mistake. But I would say also if we can give the film some room and some benefit of the doubt, and let's try to be as generous to the film as possible, I think we could not unreasonably take even that moment and say, okay, granted it was probably a mistake, and granted it does feel pretty off, but this is a technique that's not dissimilar to, let's say, this is 1968 when this film came out, right? So this is not something that is unknown to people who, let's say, watched French New Wave films. I mean, there were jump cuts of a similar nature in certain French New Wave films. There were cuts that brought attention to the fact that this was indeed a film. And there are also these sorts of jump cuts that do exist even in documentary films of the like. And so that's suggestive of this idea of out of syncness, etc. So that, in a very interesting way, combines two seemingly separate approaches, namely French New Wave on the one hand and documentary style on the other hand. But in fact, I think they're closely related in the sense that they're trying to, in many ways, be self-reflexive, and I think that self-reflexivity therefore leads to the fact that we are watching something that is a film. And whatever effect that might mean to its audience, whether it's in the context of French New Wave, which I think in general terms could be self-reflexivity as a means of commenting on art on the one hand, or self-reflexivity in documentary form as a means to further suggest a mode of realism on the other, or maybe a hybrid of the two, who knows. But my point here is that in Night of the Living Dead, in this scene between the Coopers and that jump cut, it seems to be possible to look at that as being a kind of another realistic thing, as a kind of documentary or faux documentary type of mode, if you will. And again, I know it's not on purpose, but it does maybe suggest a fact that, again, we are dealing with something that could be seen as being almost like a faux documentary on the one hand. It also, therefore, can, if we go down that road, it might seem to be something that could help or further augment the sense of realism or documentary realism in the film. And so I think it could be seen as being consistent with what I was trying to suggest earlier. Although I do admit that I think it is very jarring, and even the filmmakers, I think, are they acknowledge the fact that it wasn't meant to be like that. But even those mistakes can turn into potential strengths of the film, or they can go along with a certain interpretation of the film. That's my point here. So anyway, my friends, let me just before I continue on, let me just return to the live chat and see what you have to say. Let's see. GR62 says, it may be a stretch, but I see Night of the Living Dead as the beginning of the space virus and The Last Man on Earth, another story towards the... Oh, yes, you mentioned these two films. That's a very interesting suggestion about these two films. I never really thought about that, but that's really interesting. You know, the virus, or is it virus, or is it... in the film, it's referred to as, what is it, the radiation from the Venus probe. So it's not clear if it's a virus or if it's just radiation or what, but that is something else I do want to get into in the context of a discussion of how the zombies, the monsters here are depicted. But Carl, hello, Carl. Carl says, a landmark genre film. Wouldn't call it my favorite of Romero's. Dawn of the Dead and the highly unique Martin I find preferable, but we'd have neither without Night of the Living Dead. Here, my friend. Well said. And let's see. Paula says, I've never seen Dawn of the Dead, but it's now on my list to watch next. Yes, it's quite a... it's very recommended. It's a horror film. It's quite grisly in places, so... but if you're okay with that, I strongly recommend that. Abram says, I'm going to order this right after the live stream. Absolutely loved my first viewing. Truly groundbreaking. Also, U.S. Watchers, is the Barnes & Noble sale starting Tuesday? I'll be making a video about that very soon. I don't have any information about the Barnes & Noble sale, by the way, but it might, I don't know, if it wouldn't surprise me if it started on November 1st. I've heard some rumblings on Facebook from people who said that they've talked with people, when they went into Barnes & Noble, talked with people who worked at the store. I don't know. I'm not sure. But, well, I'll keep my ear to the ground. If I hear anything, I'll let you know, of course. And if anyone hears anything about the Barnes & Noble sale, please let us know. But anyway, returning to the film. Okay. So, okay. Emily says, hey Daisuke, I can only stay for a short while, but glad to be here for the start of the discussion, and we'll catch up on the rest of the chat later on. Well, Emily, I hope you're well, and look forward to talking to you again very soon. Excuse me. So, all right, just getting some air in here. So, let's see. Okay. Yes, JR62 says, I saw the dailies on the supplements. Yes, so that the dailies are part of this Criterion supplements here. It gave a vibe of actors at work rather than part of a movie. Enjoyed it. Yes, again, the dailies are a real gem, and they show again the kind of efforts that were really put into the film. It's really fantastic. Real classic film reviews. Hi from northeast of England. This remains such an influential film. Criterion's edition is top notch. Paula says it hasn't been officially confirmed. Oh yes, about the. Oops, I just jumped again. I just jumped. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I was doing this in mid Paula's comments, so I really apologize. But I know someone who asked a Barnes & Noble employee, and they said November 1st and generally runs all month. Can't wait. Oh yes, so Paula has the information there. Or at least it hasn't been officially confirmed, but it might be happening. So thank you, Paula. Lufrin, our dear friend, hello. Hello, it's nice to see you. I hope you're well, my friend. Okay. Let's see. Oh, Eddie Green's 101. Hello. Hello. I'm looking forward to hearing your views on the latest Terminator film. Looking forward to it very much. Stephen Jones, hello. Night of the Living Dead was a truly groundbreaking film and holds up today, even though it was shot in black and white. Yes, I agree. I agree. In fact, the black and white element of the film is another thing that I think is to its strength. You know, there's a very interesting supplement here. Some of the supplements are really fascinating because sometimes you can see color photographs of the shoot. I think it's the supplement with, what was it? It was the one talking about talking with the actors, some of the actors who played zombies in the film, and they were actually showing photos that were just taken on the shoot, and there was one photo in particular that was in color. And I think the context was please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the context was the fashion and what these zombies would be wearing and stuff. And there was one photo that I remember seeing that was a color photograph, and it was like pink, a dress that was really bright, vibrant pink or something like that. And I thought, gosh, thank goodness this film was shot in black and white. Of course, there's nothing wrong with zombie wearing a pink dress, don't get me wrong, and there's nothing wrong with that sort of thing. But also, you could see the color of I think the makeup that was applied, and I was reminded almost immediately of Dawn of the Dead, George Romero's Dawn of the Dead. Now, again, I don't want to get into too many details about Dawn of the Dead, and don't get me wrong, Dawn of the Dead is one of my all-time favorite films. I just adore that film. Just immensely, absolutely immensely. But there is a certain approach to the zombies in that film. It's a color film, etc. That I would say is markedly different than the approach of I should say the ghouls in Night of the Living Dead. And I think the fact that Night of the Living Dead is in black and white really adds a lot. Actually, I would even suggest that if it were in color, would have taken away from the effect, and that's because there is a real scariness to these ghouls in black and white. It almost drains them of any humanity, if you will. I mean, there's no real way of distinguishing between them except their scars and their states of decomposition, or their other little weird characteristic or makeup details, etc. Some are dressed. There's some that aren't dressed. There are just some that have really ghastly makeup on. There's some that don't have any makeup on at all. That sort of thing. But I think my point is that I'm trying to make is that I think the black and white photography really creates a sense of horror and foreboding, and it makes the proceedings much more ghastly in the long run. Even the special effects, which I think are very sparsely used, we do still get squibs to simulate bullet wounds, and we do get moments where the shots of blood and stuff like that. We get the scene with the knife and the hand, etc. But special effects are sparsely used here, but also that adds to the overall effect. What's that way of putting it? The horror that's generated in the mind is much more horrible than anything that we can see on screen. And I think a lot of that is true. especially with this film. But it is a I think the black and white photography is really one of the film's strengths. And I think had it been in color, it would probably, I would hazard a guess to say it might have taken away from the overall effect of the film, because it would have highlighted the fact that it highlighted more colors and things like that that probably might have taken away from its overall effect. Now, again, this is not to suggest that Dawn of the Dead is in any way less effective film, but I think Dawn of the Dead is a completely different type of film than Night of the Living Dead. And it's doing things that I think are really different than Night of the Living Dead. So in that sense, I think as a color film, Dawn of the Dead is really a masterpiece. And I'm not suggesting that color and zombies don't mix. I'm just saying that color in this particular film versus black and white in this particular film, any day of the week, go with the black and white, of course. There is, of course, the colorized version that was released, but it was a bit of a, I don't know, I find that to be a little bit strange, you know. And also, the black and white photography, I should just take a step back, you know. When I talked about the low budgetness of the film, that's one thing. But at the same time, it's not all low budget. It's not all low budget. There's some really highly charged visual elements of this film, just so overly stylized, which is brilliant. And in particular, when Barbara comes into the farmhouse for the beginning, you notice the shadows on the walls there and the way the lights are lighting the walls. It's all jagged shadows, and as I suggest, it's almost like the cabinet of Dr. Caligari in many senses. It almost warps the world around them, the physical world around them. In particular, I love the moment when they go up, Barbara first and then Ben later. They go up, or each of them in their own turn goes up the staircase, and they see the dead body at the top of the stairs there. And the light, as it shines on their faces through the bars there, I think is really quite fascinating. And those are strong, highly charged, highly stylized and charged moments that kind of go against this thesis that I was trying to propose about the low budgetness. I think actually the film is a balance between these two. And so you've got low budgetness on the one hand, or the cinema verite on the one hand, a faux documentary on faux documentary on the one hand, and then here on the other hand, you have highly charged visual moments or stylized moments. And so among these moments are the quick zooms, and the use of lighting. And I think the lighting in particular, it creates almost, as I say, German expressionism effect. It also is like, it's almost like film noir as well. It's also like, there's also, I think the essay in the Criterion Collection makes reference also to Goya as well, which is, I think, an interesting comment to make. But my point is that those stylized moments, I think, become so much more effective in black and white. And I think that's a testament to the strength of the black and white photography here. It's really great. And therefore, that I agree completely that this should be a film in black and white. And its strength is so, it's undeniable. Its black and white photography is undeniable. It's powerful, absolutely powerful. So thank you very much for that. Oh gosh, yes. Stephen, thank you very much for that. And Mike, Mike, thank you very much for your super chat. Thank you. That's very kind of you. Very, very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you. And I hope you're well, my friend. Raven Q222 says, just finished rewatching, so glad I can catch your comment. Thank you very much. And Emily says, I love how Romero really kicked off this emphasis on the media, both in terms of our reliance on it and its deception. Its deception. Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, you know, that's interesting. That Emily, that's a really good comment. I was thinking about this, but I forgot to mention this. But our reliance on media is very important here, and I think that's one of the messages of the film which you speak to quite brilliantly here, Emily. But it's deception, which you also mentioned. This reminds me. I agree, and this reminds me. Remember that moment again? I go back to the conversation between Tom and Judy, the two of them alone. It's Judy who says, are you sure this is really the right thing to do? And remember what Tom says. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but Tom says to the effect that, I don't know, but that's what the TV says. And in fact, if we can take that in sort of character terms, Tom is really saying, right, he's relying on the TV to convince both himself and Judy that it's the right thing to go out and try to fill up the truck with gas. But in fact, what happens is that they end up dying rather gruesomely. And so, in fact, it was it could be said that it was Tom's reliance on the TV. That's what the TV says we should do. It was Tom's reliance on the TV that led to his downfall in a kind of an interesting way. And I know that's not direct, maybe it's not really a direct take on the media, but my point is that I think it could be seen as being something of a sense of reliance on TV and media and what we were talking about, without necessarily trying to think of the actual plan itself. And so there is, yes, Emily's comment here is incredibly on point and astute. Really well done, Emily. I love it. Let's see. Jared then says, I feel the low-budget nature gave the film's atmosphere a bit more personal touch. That's a really excellent way of putting it, Jared. You say it, I think I was trying to say something similar, or maybe the same thing, but you said it actually much more effectively and succinctly than I did. Well done. And Stealthborn says the same thing. The black and white makes it scarier, in my opinion. Yes, it does. And Mike says, I agree, Stealthborn. I love the look of this film. And Emily says, I think the low budget really works. Horror seems to lend itself to being unclean and imperfect, in quotes. It feels more visceral and bodily. Low budget nature. Yes, because, how should I put it? There's a lot there, and there's a lot in that comment, Emily. As per usual, you provide brilliant comments as always. But yes, the low budget nature adds to this, connected to a kind of visceral nature, or a more immediate, palpable horror. I agree with that, because there is I think a part of that is the fact that it feels real in terms of how the film is trying to approach it. But also there are tonal shifts in amongst that approach to documentary realism that then suddenly shift the film into real flights of horror. Suddenly the lights go out, and then the music swells, and suddenly all the zombies start to attack. This idea of the love, the bond between parents and children, in particular Cooper and his daughter, and that final last gasp of life. And what does he do? What does he do? This character of Cooper, right? He's been the antagonist of the film, but I think ultimately what he did was he just loved his daughter. And what does he do at the very end? He just tries to reach out to his daughter. That's all he thought about. That's all he thought of. He was in many respects, he was a terrible human being, but he still loved his daughter, right? And it was right in the moment of chaos, at the point of dying. That's what he thought about doing. So he wasn't selfish necessarily, but or at least I would suggest that he wasn't selfish. But what happens just a couple seconds later, not even minutes, but a couple seconds later, we see his arm almost devoured to the shoulder. Now, talk about quick consumption. That really, that was really fast eating. But my point is that this sudden shift from sort of melodramatic tone of expressing emotion to suddenly you are just caught in this, my goodness, what's going on? She's eating her father's arm. And she's eating it rather quickly too. And then, of course, then goes the very famous scene with the trowel and the mother, of course. But my point is that not only is the low budget effect quite jarring, the tonal shifts are quite jarring, but it's set in this documentary, realistic, faux realism, faux documentary type of mode, which then augments this palpable nature of the horror. So I agree 100% with Emily's comments here. Let me, before I move on to the live stream, before I forget, I do want to talk about the characters here, and the big dynamic is between, of course, Ben on the one hand and Cooper on the other, and they are battling for the heart and soul of the world, really. Let's talk about Ben as a character. Now, Jared mentioned at the very outset of the live chat about Dwayne Jones and the fact that, of course, Dwayne Jones, Ben is the lead, and he gets top billing in the credits. You know, it's not the first character that we see, but he is the one that we all gravitate towards. In the midst of this great chaos in the film, in the moment where Barbara, she has lost her brother, Johnny, and she's in a panic. She doesn't know what's going on. We, as an audience member, we don't quite know what's going on. It's all quite chaotic. And on that point, I'm sorry, I'm just going all over the place, but there's just so much to talk about. But before I forget, I do love how this film presents information. It doesn't present all the information at once, but it just slowly adds layers. You know, start with Johnny and Barbara, and then suddenly there's this random attack by some random guy, and then just slowly builds to the farmhouse, and as she approaches, we see the gas pump and everything, and the isolation of the farmhouse, and then we go into the farmhouse, we see all the rooms and everything, and then we go upstairs, and then we understand that there's a ground floor and upstairs, but then only later, when Ben is finishing boarding up the windows, that we see that there's actually another door behind one of the doors that actually then we find out leads to the basement, and then we see more characters emerge from the basement and what they have to do. And then all this, and as all that is going on, we have the accumulation of the number of zombies outside, etc. And then slowly we get information about that these are undead, that how they are killed, how to attack them, and then the rescue state, all that stuff. And then only later do we get information about the Coopers and what happened to their daughter and how she was bitten, and then suddenly we get all this stuff, the layering of information. It's not everything piled on at the very outset, but it's slowly giving us information until the very end, and so it becomes a collective at the very end. But I just love that approach to information. But where was I? So in that context, of course, early on, at the midst of the point of chaos where you don't quite know what's going on, and Barbara doesn't know what's going on, and she goes up and she discovers the dead body at the top of the stairs there, she just screams and rushes out of the house, and there we see, in this flash of light, Ben, and a huge extreme close-up on his face. It's really quite remarkable. It's quite an entrance of a character, and he comes in, and he, at the moment, he provides a sense of calm and leadership from the very beginning, doesn't he? And so it's great that we are introduced to him first, because I think we therefore gravitate towards him as viewers, and our sympathies lie with him as a character, because he seems to exude the strength of character. He seems to know what he's trying to do, or what his mission is. Okay. But Ben, as a character, I think, as great as the character is, and I think it's a really great character, in the context of the story, Ben is a very flawed character, is he not? And I say that because, first of all, let's take a step back. He is arguing that the best strategy against the attack would be to stay on the ground floor and board up all the doors and windows. And of course, Cooper's strategy is to have everyone go downstairs into the basement and lock the one door there. Okay, so that's the famous battle of strategy, very famous, and it leads to that what is it? Cooper was right kind of thing, right? But my point is that's a very famous struggle between the two of them. Should they stay on the ground floor? Or they should stay on the basement floor. Actually, I should point out that I always thought that why didn't they think about staying on the top floor? I mean, they could have just stayed on the top floor and just blockaded the stairwell with, I don't know, with couches or tables or something like that. So they could have blocked up the stairwell so that the zombies couldn't, they could still stay on the top floor and they could still see what was going on. And they could kind of hide and put everything up there. But then if the zombies came in, then they couldn't walk up the stairwell because they would have the stairwell blocked. I always thought the top floor was the great compromise between the two of them. But in any event, perhaps my thinking is also flawed because the zombies would have become alerted to their presence. And so that could have been a downfall to the strategy of using the top floor. But I don't know. You're right. The top floor was used when Cooper was throwing the Molotov cocktails out there just to give Ben and Tom some cover to run outside into the truck, right? So the top floor could have served a lot of strategic purposes. So I never understood why they couldn't fight for the top floor rather than duel between staying on the ground floor or staying in the basement. Also, there's this notion of setting perimeters up. There's an outer perimeter and an inner perimeter. And so I always thought it would have been, and what eventually happens in the film, of course, there's, in a sense, that sort of outer perimeter. There's an outer perimeter that should be fortified to a certain extent, but then you should have fallback positions in case the perimeters are breached, which is in fact what happens. Or I think Cooper was trying to suggest we should just focus on the inner perimeter, not focus on the outer perimeter. And so I think Cooper's strategy was in some ways flawed. And in fact, I think the combination of the two strategies, Ben and Cooper's, I think was the ideal strategy because Ben was essentially fighting for the outer perimeter, whereas Cooper was insisting on the inner perimeter. And so I think the outer perimeter, inner perimeter dynamic was eventually, as we can see from the results of the film, that was the strategy that led to safety, at least for Ben anyway. So that was the ideal strategy. So perhaps that is that should go against my own personal strategy of staying on the top floor, because if you have the top floor, you don't have an inner perimeter and outer perimeter, you just have the top floor. And actually, you're leaving yourself in a position of vulnerability. If the zombies come in and maybe they knock over something and it causes a fire, what happens then? There's no means of escape, etc. So maybe the top floor strategy, the more I think about it, the more it's probably filled with some vulnerabilities. But in any event, my friends, you have the struggle between Ben and Cooper, and in fact, the combination of their two strategies is, in fact, I think what it was the ideal situation ultimately. But my point here is that Ben was wrong in terms of his strategy. Now he didn't, you couldn't know that he was wrong until the attack actually happened. So it's not like he meant to be wrong. It's not like he was. I don't think he was stupid or anything like that. I think he was very intelligent. It's just that he just made the wrong choice. And it became another one of the film's ironies, was it not, that it was in fact Cooper's plan that saved Ben in the end. So, in terms of strategy, we know that Cooper was right and Ben's strategy was somewhat flawed, not somewhat quite flawed. But there are also aspects of Ben's character that I think create a complexity to him. He does seem to show flashes of anger. His temper tends to flare up with Barbara. And he's frustrated because Barbara seems already to be in a sense of maybe either panic on the one hand or catatonia on the other. She doesn't seem to be quite responsive. Now, he's trying his best to think of a plan to board up the house, trying to get nails, etc., hammer nails, etc. So he's a bit frustrated, and so he lashes out occasionally. And remember when Barbara is in a panic about Johnny, and Johnny is not dead, and he says, your brother's dead, and he's not, and suddenly she slaps him on the face, and he slaps him back, but actually, it looks almost like a punch, actually. it doesn't look like it looks like a punch, really. It's really quite jarring. And there's that moment when I alerted to before about how they're watching TV and he's just nonchalantly putting the gun on his lap and is pointing in the direction of Harry Cooper. And he uses the gun, he shoots the gas pump, which fortunately at that moment it didn't cause an explosion. I mean, it's an interesting plot twist that we see in the 1990 remake of the film Night of the Living Dead, actually, but I won't talk about that. But here, in the context of the 1968 film, he uses a gun to shoot at the gas pump, and the assumption being that caused, a bit of panic among them, and he left the torch by the truck. And so when the gasoline started to spurt out there and spill all over the place, it then caused the fire to ignite, and then it led to the fire catching on the part of the tire of the back of the truck there. And so he didn't mean to do it, but it was his choice of putting the torch there that led to the fire starting in the first place. And that led, of course, ultimately to the demise of Tom and Judy. If you look also the way that the film presents the boards and the way the windows and doors are boarded up, Cooper was somewhat right. It's flimsy. It's quite flimsy. And there's a famous shot of after the everything has been boarded up, he goes and talks with Barbara in the living room there, and he says, everything's boarded up solidly or something. And we actually see in the background behind him a window that's not even boarded up at all. Now, there's a reason for that. I think that's explained in one of the commentaries, in fact, that there was a little bit of a drop outside of that window, which probably meant that there was no need to have that window boarded up. But visually speaking, we don't know that as viewers, and so it adds a sense of Ben almost not being reliable at that moment, and he doesn't even know that he's not reliable. So in other words, he doesn't mean to be that way, but it's just that it's the way he's figuring it out. And he's the one who says, I feel bad for that little kid down there, that her father's so stupid. Whereas in fact, Cooper he had the right strategy all along, and Cooper is actually, his intuition is quite right. He says, even with little things, like, the TV's not working, so he says, fiddle with the rabbit ears. He does it in that really irritating Cooper way, of course, which is, he doesn't go and help them, but he knows what to do. So he says, fiddle with the rabbit ears, and I think that's what happens, how they catch a signal. And also when the lights go out, remember? When the lights go out at the end there, at the final act of the film, and then you have the wonderful moment of the music, da-dum, and the lights go out, and da-dum, and then it's Ben who says, I'll go downstairs and see if there's a fuse box. And he leaves Harry alone in there, and he says, it's not the fuse. Harry knows that it's due to the zombies out there. They've probably torn down a power wire or something like that. So he knows. And he also knows that, and early the debate between Ben and Cooper early on, when they're talking, when Ben is trying to say, I can handle them. They're not so easy they're not so difficult to handle. And then Cooper says, didn't I just finish explaining to you that they turned over our car? And then Ben says, they could do that if they're in large numbers. And then Cooper says, that's my point. And I don't think Ben has a good comeback to that in terms of a debate strategy. And he says, because, remember, he says, Cooper says, there could be 15, 20, there could be 100 of them trying to come out and trying to break down the door. And then what does Ben say? He doesn't have a good comeback to it. He says, well, if that's the case, then they'll probably get at us wherever we are. And I think his point is that even if we barricade themselves in the cellar, they'll still get at us. But he's missing the point. He's missing the point because the fortification of one place is stronger than having to fortify many places. And I think that was Cooper's point. And that's another example of where you've got this great mismatch of communication between characters. But also, in terms of Ben Ben's approach, I think his debate style was also not so strong. Granted, too, Cooper's debate style is not so strong when he is pressed by Tom as to, okay, if they went into the basement, if they got in, then they would be all dead. They would be done for. And Cooper doesn't have a good comeback to that as well. So it's not like Cooper is the best debater in the world also. But my point is that neither is Ben. And I think Ben's anger also gets the better of him. And I think it's part of the reason why he doesn't listen. And it comes up in 2 points, and I'll try to explain it to you as best I can. Early in the film, when he first meets Barbara, remember there are some flashes of anger and temper that flare up. But there's also the point, remember, where he's undoing the legs of the dining room table, I think. And then he just goes into a story about how they started to attack him, and he drove through them. They flew in the air like bugs, that very famous story that he gave. And then suddenly it cuts to Barbara and her story about Johnny, and they were visiting the graveyard. And they're visiting the grave of, she reveals it was their late father. And so reveals a story about how the zombie attacked him. And this is the recounting, essentially, the beginning of the film. Although there are some little details that I think are very interesting that she mentions in her story that didn't quite happen in real life. Remember, she says she went over to try to apologize to the Bill Heinzman Cemetery zombie. Whereas in the actual film itself, I don't recall her actually going to him trying to apologize. She's just walking, rather trying to shyly get away. She doesn't say, good evening or something, or excuse me or something. She doesn't try to make any conversation with the cemetery zombie. She's just suddenly attacked. And so the fact that she's recalling later when she's talking to Ben about how after Johnny made his joke, she decided to go over to this man and to apologize. Well, I don't seem to think that happened. So I love that there's almost a nice little element there where we're being told something after the fact that's not quite true. And perhaps that might, I don't know, maybe is it a stretch to think that this idea of recounting or telling things after the fact with little details that are slightly off? I mean, that's what happens with reporting, etc. You report things, but things might be slightly off. I love that little detail, but I know Barbara isn't a reporter, or at least we don't know what her vocation is. But anyway, going back to Barbara here. So she's recounting her story. If you look at Ben's reaction, he's kind of fed up. There's a moment of ambiguity when she starts to say, oh, it's kind of hot in here. And she just loosens her coat. And she reveals her blouse of her dress. And it cuts to Ben in a very interesting way. And it's either registering frustration or something, or maybe it's registering a bit of discomfort, and I think it goes also to the fact that he is an African American man and she is a white woman, but I'll get to that later as well. But going back to Ben here, he is reacting to her as saying, I don't even want to listen to you. That sort of look on his face. And he's just not listening to her. And she's trying to tell her story. And he's just saying, you should calm down, don't stop talking or something like that. And so that's an example of Ben not necessarily listening or not seeming to listen to what's going on. In fact, actually, he is listening. And we know that he's listening because remember at the end of the conversation, he says, look, your brother is dead. And she says, oh, he is not dead. So you know that he was listening to some extent about her story, to the fact that he knows enough information now to know that, in fact, Johnny was her brother and all that stuff. And so, but my point is that he is, it's almost like he doesn't, he's listening or he's not listening, but he has this attitude that's very, he's almost like fed up with Barbara in a sense. And that attitude also carries over with the point when Cooper and Tom emerge from the basement cellar. I think he's fed up because he's worked so hard to board up the doors and windows here, so he's probably very physically and mentally exhausted. So it's not like his attitude is unreasonable. On the contrary, I don't think it's unreasonable. But my point is that he's meeting these characters at a point where he is very stressed, and so that I think has immediately marked the relationship, or at least his means of trying to approach Cooper, and that leads to the antagonism of the two of them. And so I think had Ben been a little bit calmer, and this is true for Cooper as well, had they been calmer, they could have they could have had a connection in terms of their communication. They could have created a plan to get out of there. But unfortunately, it didn't lead to any fruitful connection. And in fact, that's another example of the mismatch of communication between characters, I think. But I think that mismatch isn't coming from external forces, unfortunately, but it's also generated, or I think primarily generated from internal forces. And one of those internal forces, for better or for worse, unfortunately, is the fact that Ben didn't seem to be willing to listen. And so, and of course, I think the same is true for Cooper. Right now, Cooper is. I'm sorry. Before I get to Cooper, one more thing about Ben here, which is really key. Really key here is the fact that he is an African American. Now, this is one of the most famous aspects of this film. The fact that we see this Ben, who is an African American, in the lead of this film. This point in time in U.S. cinema, 1968, which is carried through in such a heart-wrenching fashion by the fact that Ben dies in the way he does. And we see the aftermath of his body and the way he is treated by the so-called posse, right, at the end of the film, which is heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. And there's also the 1968. This is a very turbulent time in terms of the United States and race relations. And so this become, in terms of the political climate and race relations, let me put it that way. And so this is a very big deal, very big deal. But what makes it so fascinating is that, well, there are a couple things that make it fascinating. One, according to George Romero, and crew, there wasn't a conscious effort to cast Dwayne Jones in the lead because he was African American. It was because he was the best actor around, and so these social commentary elements didn't quite. Apparently, they weren't necessarily on the forefronts of everyone's minds at the time of making the film, which I think makes the statement, the social commentary statement of the film, all the stronger, in my opinion. The fact that it wasn't necessarily intentional, which I think is if true, it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But what makes this even much more complicated is the fact that Ben, as I was trying to suggest, is a flawed character, or at least his thinking is quite flawed, and he also is not the in the end he might not necessarily be the most reliable character. He's certainly perhaps the most likable character in the film, but he's certainly not the most reliable character in the film. Cooper, on the other hand, is probably the least likable character in the film, but he is in many ways the most reliable character in the film. But the fact that Ben is the way that I've tried to describe him to be makes that whole social commentary aspect of this and race relations much more complicated, because we realize, in terms of strategy, as much as we like him, we can't rely on him. As much as we want to root for him, we realize that his thinking is flawed because we know how the film ends. Another thing that's really interesting, and we can try to carry this through, is that if we are to take this film and we are to take the battle between Cooper and Ben, a white man and a black man, if we are to take this psychological struggle between them in the context of race relation, now I'm not quite comfortable with that interpretation of this particular element of the film. I don't necessarily see Harry in any way express anything with regard, at least overtly anyway, with regard to Ben on account of his race. I don't see any of that in the Harry Cooper character. But if on a broad level, on a macro level, if we were to take the psychological battle between Harry, a white man on the one hand, and Ben, a black man on the other hand, it's this idea that, and Ben explains it rather succinctly and rather bluntly and brilliantly, which is, you're boss down there, I'm boss up here, I'm fighting for everything up here. So it's like he is creating the territory. Ben is, anyway, the territory of the ground floor versus the territory of the cellar. And so the territory of the cellar as supported by Harry, a white man, versus the territory of the ground floor, or the first floor, as protected by Ben, an African-American man. And so we have these, in very blunt building block sort of terms, if you will. The upstairs is Ben's territory, and the downstairs is Harry's territory, right? And Ben himself says it this way: "I'm boss up here." So his strategy is essentially trying to prove that he can be boss, if you know what I mean. I think in many ways, if he goes down into the cellar, it could be seen as being a sort of capitulation or an acknowledgement that he is not boss, if you know what I mean. And if he acknowledges that he is not boss, then on a sort of human level, he has lost, right? Because on a human level, again, on a macro level, it's like he cannot survive unless he goes into the realm where Harry is boss, where a white man is boss. Let's put it that way. And again, I don't see Harry Cooper as that kind of character directly, but again, I'm talking about on the broad macro level of the film. So in many ways, this struggle is really quite fundamental, and it makes it even more ironic that the only way that Ben could survive the attack is by going to the place where he is not boss. And therefore, it's a capitulation in a way. He has lost that battle in a sense. He loses either way, right? Which is even much more tragic. He loses, right? On the one hand, if he were to stay up top, where he claims he is the boss, he will lose because the zombies will overcome him. If he goes down to the bottom into the cellar there, he will lose on the account that he is not boss there. That's who he was fighting against. Okay. Either way, he loses. Why? Because after he emerges from the cellar, what happens to him? He gets shot. Right? And that is also a very key moment too. I know that a lot has been made of this group of armed white men patrolling the countryside, shooting down the zombies, and the symbolism is quite vivid here, of them shooting this Ben, and then sticking meat hooks into and burning his body amongst others in the bonfire at the end. I mean, the symbolism is inescapable. Of course, it's very powerful. But I would also suggest, again, this is pure speculation on my part, but recall the moment where you've got, he says, I saw someone, there's someone in the house, or I saw something move. And then it cuts to a shot of Ben from the outside looking through the window. You notice that there's darkness, right? You don't quite see the full visage of Ben. So you could kind of understand if someone mistakes Ben at that particular moment for being someone else, okay? Because at least from the outside looking in, you don't quite see the outline of the face, etc. You see an outline, but you don't see the characteristics of the face, etc. Then it cuts to a close-up of Ben, a sharp close-up to his face, and it's lit down. And so we understand that this is sort of a stylistic close-up. And then we go back to the sheriff, and he says, all right, there you go, shoot him right between the eyes, and then boom. that's the end of Ben, the tragic end. It's one of the tragic, most ironic endings of any film. But what is so frightening about that moment is, of course, we understand that Sheriff McClellan and his band are roaming around zombies, and that's what they're doing. But what's really frightening is they don't describe Ben at that moment as a zombie. They just see something in there, right? They don't use the word ghoul. They don't use, oh, there's another ghoul. They just use something, and I saw there's someone or something, and they use these terms that if we were to be cynical, and I'm not saying that the film is overtly or directly suggesting this, but if we were to take the film and our interpretation, a subjective interpretation of the film, to a real far cynical end, how do we even know that they are confident that he is a zombie, that Ben is a zombie? What if, and I'm speculating here, what if those characters, right, the armed men, when they see what is Ben in the house, what if they actually knew? What if they could see well enough to know that Ben was not a zombie? What if they shot him on purpose, knowing that he wasn't a zombie? Okay. And I think that, and I'm not saying that this is the one and only interpretation of that particular moment of the film, but my point is that that moment is vague enough, and it's presented vaguely enough, such that one can carry that moment to a far, far cynical interpretation. And it would still hold water, I think, because of what we've seen before. Now, going back to Ben and his no-win situation, this is a complete no-win situation, because it is a no-win situation on top of a no-win situation, right? Which therefore makes his struggle, his now micro-level struggles with Barbara and then with Harry Cooper, etc., all the more important. And therefore I think that's very understandable, therefore, that our sympathies, or at least my sympathies, lie with him, and we want him to win. Psychologically speaking, anyway. We want everyone to survive, of course, but my point here is that he is in a no-win situation from the very beginning, and I think that his being an African American in this role, highlights this in a way that is just inescapable. And I think it makes his struggle with Cooper, and the fact that Cooper was right and Ben was wrong, I think all the more understandable if we look at it in those terms. Again, I don't mean to suggest that that's what the characters were directly thinking, but I think on a macro level, I think that's what's going on, or that's one possible interpretation, of course. And to round off that conversation, of course, we have Harry Cooper. And Harry Cooper, of course, he is right, but he is the most reliable, but he's the least likable. He is very unlikable, and it's the way that he expresses himself. He doesn't express, or he doesn't outwardly express sympathy. When he first meets Barbara, he doesn't really care or seem to care about him, and he's very cold. He says, "You should watch the TV because I don't want to be responsible for you," that sort of thing. And he's just seemingly very much selfish. He's just thinking of himself. But as I was trying to suggest earlier, his last gasp of life was what? Was a final attempt to reach out to his daughter one final time. And so that makes his character very nuanced and quite complex. He seems therefore to be, that moment seems to suggest therefore that he has a caring soul, but he expresses himself so terribly so as to make himself so unlikable amongst not only the group and also from his wife, but also from the audience as well, even though he is right strategically. So Harry, too, might be suffering from a similar kind of character flaw that one might suggest Ben was suffering from, namely that it's their outward expressions that tended to lead to conclusions that led to the downfalls of the characters. And I think in Harry's case, it was probably more explicit, more active than Ben's, although Ben's was still there and it came out in certain instances. But so in many respects, they are quite similar. And that also leads one to the conclusion that had they worked together, they could have had, not only strategically, but also in terms of a harmony amongst the group, that could have led to a different conclusion for the group altogether. But oh well, things happen, I suppose. And that leads to the great drama of the film, which is Night of the Living Dead. So anyway, sorry about that, but let me just go back to the chat here, and then we can go from there. Okay, so sorry if I'm skipping over your comments, but just for the sake of time, I'm just going to go through here. I see, yes, okay. There's a great conversation amongst everyone here in the live chat, which is brilliant. Okay, and let's see here. So, okay. Matthew says, the reason this movie is so terrifying is because of how flawed and human the characters are. It makes you care about them and puts you there. Yes, I agree. I absolutely agree. That's really great. Let's see. Just going through the comments some more. Emily says again, I wonder if that catastrophic explosion death speaks to a kind of juxtaposition of peace and love with horrible violence, considering the year the film came out might be a stretch. I don't know. I don't think that's necessarily a stretch. I think there's something to be said there again about the tonal shift regarding how the characters of Tom and Judy are treated in the film. Yes, I agree. Let's see. All right, just keep going here. All right. Again, okay, here we go. Yes, Stealthborn says, yes, yes, I remember the jump cut is a tad jarring, but I accept it for what it is. Yes, I'm with you there, Stealthborn. Paul says, I love how the focus is on the behavior of the characters and their natures. It's what resonated with me the most about the film. That's a really good point. The focus is on the characters. Let's see. Heirloom Providence says, the editing of when Barbara enters the house always felt jarring to me. How quickly it goes from light outside to dark, very disorienting, possibly not on purpose, but effective. Yes, I think also the lighting is very interesting, right? Barbara says at the very beginning, it's 8 o'clock and it's still light. And I think what that, it's not described specifically like this in the film as far as I recall, but I think the assumption that it's that's probably the onset. I always thought in my mind, the fact that it was still light and suddenly shifts to darkness in the moment that you're talking about. I always thought that had to do with the Venus probe radiation. It was the point in time that the Venus probe radiation had its full-on effect was around the time that Barbara and Johnny arrived at the cemetery. And so, and then as the radiations tended to subside, but then still the effects were still lingering, it then turned to dark. So I always thought that the radiation had the effect on the light that way, but that was probably my own way of trying to figure out what was the maybe trying to figure out in my mind how to justify everything, but it's still very effective in terms of the lighting, especially that first moment in the farmhouse when we see all those jagged shadows on the wall. I guess Malachite says the same thing. If it was radiation from a space probe, wouldn't that make the film a sci-fi horror? Yes, probably. And also, Malachite, you bring up a great point, which is what I want to talk about too before we wrap up, which is the zombies. The zombies here, or the ghouls, or the living dead, the flesh-eating ghouls. They are right. The conceit here is, or the idea here, the implication here is that it's according to the information. one of the theories that's being posited by the authorities in the film is that maybe it might have to do with the Venus probe radiation. Now, we don't know. We don't have any glimpses of the Venus probe radiation directly. We don't have any validation of that theory, at least when we see the film. We don't see any confirmation of the correctness or incorrectness of that. All we know is that that shot in Washington with the reporters and the government officials, etc. That's basically it, and that's all we know, and that's essentially what happens. Now, as I said, I think there might be details of the light, the daylight versus the night, and how things turn quickly dark. It's 8 o'clock and still light. And all the flashes of lightning. It could be suggestive. It could be consistent with the Venus probe radiation theory. Okay, but we're not sure. We're not sure. So, on the one hand, it's not overtly a science fiction horror film per se, but I do know what you're saying. Now, going back to the zombies. Now, if we assume that the Venus probe radiation theory is correct here, namely it was the onset of this radiation from outer space that caused the dead to come back to life and operate the way they do, which is try to seek out the flesh of humans, warm-blooded humans, okay, which is really interesting because there's a lot made about how the zombies here, or the ghouls here, tend to exhibit traits that might seem to be somewhat inconsistent with the traits of the zombies that we saw in later films by George Romero. Now, again, this live stream is not meant to be a discussion of the entirety of the Romero Dead films, but I do want to focus on this point only, which is the way that the monsters are depicted here, the zombies or the ghouls here. Right, because there are what seem to be somewhat inconsistencies. Right, the cemetery ghoul at the beginning, he picks up like a brick or stone. He tries to break through the window of the car there, and he does. And we see him running. Instead of we see him running towards the car, we see a ghoul. Who's Marilyn Eastman in makeup in the middle of the film, reach out towards a bug on the tree there and eat it with relish, right? And other things like that, which seem to be somewhat inconsistent with the way in which zombies are depicted in films like Dawn of the Dead or Day of the Dead. And even to take that further, right? There's this wonderful conceit between walking the zombies and running zombies, with Zack Snyder's remake of Dawn of the Dead and Running Zombies, or 28 Days Later, although those weren't really zombies, but this idea of modern day horror films like this, and they show zombies running, and then George Romero's zombies were always described as slow walking zombies. In fact, actually, the first zombie we ever saw in a Romero film, Night of the Living Dead, Bill Heinzman Cemetery's ghoul, he was actually running. So even in the George Romero zombie universe, we do see running zombies to an extent anyway. But my point is that there's a seemingly somewhat inconsistent approach to zombies if we go across the span of the entirety of the Romero Dead films, okay? Because we do see zombies here, for instance, using tools. They use stones to break the headlights of the truck. One uses the burnt out remains of the dining table leg to break down the door. Another uses stone or brick to throw through the plate glass window. And we saw the cemetery zombie, the ghoul, at the very outset of the film, breaking through the glass. We never saw this kind of approach towards like breaking glass and stuff in other Dead films. So it could be seen as being an inconsistency from this film on the one hand and the other films to follow. Insofar as its approach to the monsters and the zombies. Okay, I grant you. Okay, I get that. I completely get that. But on the other hand, I can sort of accept that in a little bit of maybe gymnastics in my head, if we recall that, or I always see and I'm talking about the three zombie films, Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead. It's interesting to try to see those as all taking place within the same universe. And I think in one respect, we can look at all these films taking place in the same universe. I think that's possible. But another equally viable way of approaching each of the films is that each film is its own take on this overall story conceit, namely the breakdown of society and the zombies, etc., and how this sudden catastrophe affects human relationships. Do they break down, or do they become fortified even more? And here in Night of the Living Dead, I would suggest, right, that the breakdown of relationships is what results here, and we will leave it to you and to those of you who plan to watch Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead to figure out if indeed that same result occurs in those films, or do they lead to different results. I don't know. But in any event, it's this idea of a zombie apocalypse and how it affects human relationships. So, and of course other things as well. But in that is the key component of the zombies, right? And I can look at each film as being its own hermetically sealed universe, not necessarily related to the other films in the Dead series. So in that sense, therefore, I can, from that point of view, I can accept that there might be inconsistencies from film to film to film, in particular from Night of the Living Dead to the other films, with regard to how the zombies or how the ghouls are depicted. Here they seem to be using tools, or they seem to have a bit more maybe cognitive abilities. They seem to be able to think in terms of using these external tools to their effect, to their advantage, etc. So I can understand that particular approach. And also there's an interesting thing. Remember at the very beginning with the cemetery zombie, the Bill Hindman cemetery zombie, after he attacks Johnny, and Johnny his head has been crushed on the cemetery stone there. If we were to carry through with what the conceit of the zombies is, namely, or the ghouls, is that namely they hunger for warm-blooded human flesh, then it would have made more sense for that zombie to attack Johnny and to try to essentially consume or eat Johnny. But he doesn't do that, right? What does he do? He turns his head towards Barbara, and the flash of lightning occurs, and there starts the chase. The zombie leaves, or the cemetery zombie leaves Johnny behind and goes after Barbara. And so that also might seem to be somewhat of an inconsistency in terms of how the zombies are portrayed. Here, the cemetery zombie seems to be making a conscious choice to leave Johnny behind, even though there is now is unmoving, non-resistant source of food almost. So that seems to be an odd choice if we were to remember what the zombies were. So on the one hand, that seems also to be another inconsistency. But I can forgive, if we were to look at it as an inconsistency, I can definitely forgive the film for that. Because, again, I don't want to go into too much about the other films, but I think the other films present the reason for the zombie menace as reasons that are not venous probe radiation. In other words, there are moments in those other films where key characters come in and they posit as to what they think the reason for the zombie apocalypse is. One character in one of the films says very famously, when there's no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth, right? And then there's another character in another film that says, I think we are being punished by our creator. And so these are two, I think, relatable but still very distinct things. One is talking about this idea of hell as being overpopulation in a weird way, and then another is talking about this idea of punishment from some kind of divine being or divine intervention as being manifest in this zombie apocalypse. And then we have here, which is the venous probe radiation. So we have different almost viewpoints as to the reasons for this zombie menace. And so if we are to therefore take those viewpoints at their word, then I can forgive the fact that maybe this film's approach on zombies is slightly different to this film's approach on zombies, which is slightly different to this film's approach on zombies. Here, the Night of the Living Dead zombies do things that Dawn of the Dead zombies might not necessarily do, but I can forgive that. Also, there is this thing about how there are, in the other films, there is this thing about how certain zombies tend to exhibit flashes of intelligence and instinct to their past human lives. And that theme is taken a little bit in Dawn of the Dead, a lot in Day of the Dead, and actually quite a lot in another film called Land of the Dead. And so that strain of approach to the monster, if you will, therefore might suggest that maybe we are seeing in the early film, Night of the Living Dead, examples of these more highly intelligent zombies. And so that isn't necessarily something that is on its face immediately inconsistent with what we see in later zombie films. Okay, but on the other hand, I do understand that at the same time, what the circumstances of the making of this film were, that they were there's a lot of improvisation going on, or maybe they were trying to figure out a lot of things at the time. Maybe some scenes, especially at the very beginning with the cemetery, was more to do with the effect, creating the effect of the horror rather than thinking about it in terms of a ghoul or a zombie. So I get all those details, but it's fun to think about in terms of the universe that's being created here, and the approach to this monster that we saw here at the very outset, and how Romero and crew approached Night of the Living Dead and the monster. Incidentally, of course, before I move on to the comments, I do want to say, before I forget, it's interesting how Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead seem to focus on this idea of religion and the afterlife, and it's the possible connections between the afterlife on the one hand and the reasons for the zombie apocalypse on the other. Here in Night of the Living Dead, if you notice, there isn't really that much focus on religion, at least as far as I can tell. I think the only focus is on the religion. There might be some details in the farmhouse decor itself that I might not have caught specifically, but I think most directly is at the very beginning with the cemetery. Right, the cemetery, this is being the place of rest for those who have died, and this idea being that one remembers, but also there is this connection with religion and notions of afterlife. Perhaps here I might assume it might be the afterlife in the Christian context of that, and that's very interesting. And please note too that remember, it's Barbara who is the one who puts the wreath on the gravestone, which we understand later to be the gravestone of their father. And then she is the one who we assume is there showing her respect, or praying, perhaps. I don't know. Johnny is the one who doesn't pray. He says, right, what he says very famously, praying's for church. Right? So he doesn't bother with that. It's very interesting, therefore, it's kind of another bit of irony, is that it was Johnny at the very beginning who didn't pray, almost suggested of the fact that he didn't believe that there was an afterlife to begin with. But it's very interesting that of the two of them, it was he who ended up showing life after death, which is the ultimate proof, if you will, that there is indeed life after death, I suppose. And so I find that connection very interesting, but that's probably the only connection that I can see that Night of the Living Dead is trying to make vis-a-vis religion. I don't know if, therefore, we're meant to take it any more seriously than that, but I do think that... there is actually another part of religion that is mentioned, I think, in the newsroom, this idea of the news trying to tell people what to do with bodies, instead of having to wait for the customs of funeral procedures, etc., which might help those who are bereaved. This idea is you have to go out and burn the bodies immediately. So you have to forego all these funeral procedures, etc. So that also is a little bit maybe obliquely suggestive of this idea of religion, and maybe the breakdown of religion, or maybe the supplanting of one over the other. This idea of if, after all, if you think of religion as being one way of trying to deal with this concept of death, and providing this idea of maybe there is life after death, well, the ghouls or the zombies is actually just taking over that frame of thought, and it's taking this idea of one concept of life after death and completely just overtaking it and overshadowing it and destroying it and replacing it with another system of life after death. But here it's much more graphic and much more overt. That system of life after death is the zombie apocalypse. So anyway, yes, so the zombies and how they are approached here, I think, might be inconsistent from film to film to film, but I think it could also be seen to be forgivable, and also there is a way to look at the films, I think, and still see the approach to the monsters as being consistent from film to film to film. So anyway, let's see, just going back to the chat because it's now 8, and so I just want to start to wind down the conversation. But before I do, I just want to go over your comments here. Carl Massey says, last year I saw this in a courtyard projected onto a castle wall. Wow, incredible experience. Made it so much scarier. I can imagine. I can imagine what an experience that must have been. I would love to see this projected on the outside. Wow. Must have been great for the atmosphere. Jared says, it's interesting that Cooper isn't a very good person, yet is a good father. He cared about his daughter and wanted her to be safe, regardless of the safety of anyone that's not his family. That's a really good point. Yes, I actually agree with that. There's talk here about the colorized version of Night of the Living Dead, yes. Yes, Theodore is here, hello. Altron Kaiju is hello, says, love the television news show, adds so much substance to the film for me. Yes, I completely agree with you, my friend. It really adds a further sense of realism cutting into this really fantastic, fantasy-like film. Jared says, the dynamic between Ben and Cooper is truly interesting. I also find it interesting how, in the end, Cooper was right regarding how to be safe during the night, and Ben was wrong. Yes, and also I forgot to add, right, Ben shoots Cooper at the end there. He kills Cooper. I don't know if he meant to kill him, but he shoots him. And in fact, he even goes further, right? When he goes into the basement and he sees Cooper rise in what we assume to be a zombie, he shoots him not once, but I think 2 more times, which is really quite unsettling. It kind of undercuts, or it has the potential of undercutting this idea of Ben as our hero, because as despicable as we might think Cooper was at that point, as the zombies are about to attack, I don't know if that justifies Cooper being shot like he was by Ben. I don't know if it justifies that, but I don't know. At the same time, it could, because Cooper didn't help Ben at the point where Ben needed the help, but all he cared about was getting the gun. But which is an interesting point, because if you recall, at the moment when Cooper got the gun at the very end, what does he do? All we know is that he almost ordered Helen to go down into the basement. We don't, and then at that point, then Ben attacks him with a plank of wood, and then they have their struggle. What would have been interesting would have been to speculate as to what Cooper would have then done with Ben. Would Cooper have then said, okay, you go down into the basement too? Or would Cooper have said, you stay up here? That is an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. I think if we look at Cooper as being ultimately a compassionate person, then I could imagine him maybe asking Ben to come down to the basement with them. But I can also see the scenario quite clearly as to the possibility that Cooper would not have asked Ben to go down into the basement with the two of them. So again, we will never know, because they have their struggle, and then Ben overcomes him, and then Ben shoots him, and which I think is still quite a horrible thing for Ben to have done, but really quite horrible, actually. And that's also suggestive of what he's thinking. It's consistent with Ben's character, what we saw from the outset, as I tried to suggest earlier. It's sort of flashes of anger coming out. Not completely, but just every now and again, but it comes to a boil at the very end here, I think. Let's see. So, just going down the chat here. There's talk about color films. Yes. Alteron Kaiju says, they should have either destroyed the stairs or hid quietly in the basement, but it wouldn't have been much of a film. Yes, I agree. Yes, I absolutely agree. It's better a film for them to have the struggle rather than actually just stay in the basement or whatever. Yeah, I completely agree. Yes, Mike Eli says, I was completely shocked when he slapped her back. Yes, much harder than her slap as well. Yes, I was, again, this is something I forgot to mention too, but that slap also, and it feels almost like a punch. It reminds me a lot of 12 Angry Men. There's a difference between a slap and a punch, right? But it looks almost like a punch to me, and which is really shocking. And also, it reminds me also of what was that? What's the character's name in the Heat of the Night? Endicott, right? The scene with Endicott and. Right, that was a very shocking slap as well, and I think here the connotations are quite vivid, and it's the same. So there's that. So okay, all right. My son has just entered the room, so if you won't mind, it is after 8. Zombie. Yeah, this is zombie. Yes. So here, sit down. Okay. Let's say hello. You want to say hi? Yeah. Hello. What's your name? All right. How are you? How are you doing, buddy? Yeah, did I wake you? Was I too noisy? Sorry about that. I didn't mean to be noisy. It's now 8 o'clock in the morning, so I think it's a good time, therefore, to start winding down, if you don't mind. Again, I apologize for this. So let me just now go with the chat here, and then we can go from there. But I'm sorry, Mike, I was just trying to say that that moment between Barbara and Ben reminded me a lot of the moment in the Heat of the Night, which is a very similar very iconic moment in that film. So let's see, Jared making great comments as always about the kitchen window. Yes, Unity, Duty, and Destiny. Hello, Daisuke. I hope you're well. I hope you're well too. Thank you very much. I'm very, very glad to see you. And let's see, just scrolling down the chat here, and then we will be on our way. Yes, Paula too is making a comment about Mike's comment about the slap, and Barbara, yes, yes. I think in the commentary, George Romero was talking about how Dwayne Jones was actually quite nervous about that moment, and how he was worried about how audiences would react at that moment. So, because it's the visuals of that, especially during this time, 1968. So let's see, and just going from there, Blake, hello, and Joel Jacobson, hello. Let's see, and there's talk about Terrence Malick, which is great. Jay says, Nightel, good night, I hope you're well. And let's see, Mike Eli says, heartbreaking is the best word to describe the ending of this film. あ、それパパのだよ。これパパ取っちゃったんで、後でちゃんと直すから大丈夫だよ。ありがとう。これどこにあったの？こんの。あ、そう。パパの部屋だったよ。あ、本当？ありがとう。ありがとう。あったね。ありがとう。やった。助かった。ありがとう。じゃあ、はい。よし。All right. Okay. And Anita Bong hit 2.0. Love the discussion on the movie days. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. As Emily says, there's another one for the fire. Yes. Such a sad moment. One of the saddest moments. Oh, gosh. All right. And, well, it's already 10 past 8 here. So I have to start winding down soon, actually, because not a dog walk today. So it's not a dog walk today, but I have to take my daughter to swim practice. And so we have to leave very soon. So I really have to get going. So, and let's see. I'll just scroll down here and we will be on our way. Again, I'm skipping over a lot of comments. And if I've skipped over your comments, then I'm very much apologetic of that, and I hope you can forgive me. But let's see, you guys are having a great. Right, I know, right? That's right. That's right. They're having a great conversation in the live chat, and without me, and I think that's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And let's see. Okay, and we are here. I've reached the end. I think I've skipped over a bunch of comments here as usual, and I apologize. I apologize immensely as always, but I hope you can forgive me. And so. Let's start winding down. Do you want to wind down so that we can take Karen to swim practice? Okay, all right, we'll wind down. So let's wind down here. So again, this has been a discussion of Night of the Living Dead. It hasn't. Fortunately, there were a lot more things I wanted to talk about, which I didn't have a chance to talk about. I mean, I didn't have a chance to talk about the thing with the unfortunately, with the thing at the very end between Helen and Karen, the scene at the some other scenes with the there's some other aspect. The music I didn't have a chance to talk about, which I think is really brilliant. I love the use of the archival music as well, which I would suggest going to the Criterion Blu-ray and checking out a great supplement on the Blu-ray, which is talking specifically about the music and the use of music and how it matches the editing, etc. And I highly recommend it. And the other supplements on the Criterion Blu-ray are very recommended. As I tried to suggest earlier, it's not complete, so if you're looking for complete versions of all the supplements that have ever been made on Night of the Living Dead, your best bet is to try to get other things other than in addition to the Criterion Blu-ray. But the Blu-ray itself is magnificent, so I would strongly recommend doing that going forward. And last but not least, of course, is you, my friends, and your sort of contributions, which have been stellar, absolutely stellar, talking about this film, which I think is one of the most important films. I don't think I'd ever be able to do it justice, and I don't think I've been able to do that here today, but...
書いてないよ。
あ、それカリンだよ。うん、カリンだよ。前そう、カリン書いてくれたよ。うん、そうそう、いいよ、見てて。そう。あ、それカリンだから。カリンが書いてくれたやつ。レオ、そっちもカリンだよ。あ、上のやつはカリン。あ、そうそうそう。レオが書いて、レオが書いてくれたやつが、多分ね、違う部屋にあると思うよ。後で見せてあげるから。いい？ Okay? All right. All right. So, what was I saying? So yes, so your contributions and your comments, I think, have done wonders for this, and so you've really helped me out as always. So thank you very much, my dear friends, as always, for your enthusiasm and your takes on this. And this is just a short live stream, but the conversations hope can continue on after this is over. Please continue with the conversations. They are great, and I hope that you are enjoying this film. It is the season of Halloween, of course, and so this is one of many Halloween films that you can watch and enjoy during this exciting time. This will, again, what was I saying? Yes, the point was that, yes, please continue on with your great conversations after this live stream is over. And if you have any thoughts or comments about this film, please feel free to let me know in the comment section below. I'd love to hear anything more you want to add about this film, which is Night of the Living Dead. Okay, my friends, until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. Do you want them to watch a lot of great movies, Leo? Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, buddy. And also there's the next poll for the next live stream, which will be in November. So there's a little bit of time between now and the next live stream in November. But I will make an announcement. It'll be forthcoming, and you'll figure out the details of that very soon, I hope. So until we meet again, my friends, please have a great rest of your day, and please take good care of yourselves. All right? Want to say bye? Bye. There you go. Bye.
Bye.
All right. You're done? All right, we're done. Thank you. Thank you very much, my friends, as always, for joining me and for having a lively discussion. It's great. I missed out the discussion. There's a discussion there I noticed about. Whoa, 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 whoa. Thank you. There's a discussion there. You want to see it? Here, come here, come here. There's a discussion in the chat about like, Ted Turner and Terrence Malick and Douglas Sirk, I think. It was great. It was all over the place. It was really great, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah? Yeah. And you really enjoyed the live chat, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Want to have some quick breakfast? All right.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to have breakfast. So, all right, my friends, till we meet again. Bye-bye.